I had taken on a lot of shame and guilt from being raised in a sheltered and religious environment. So I was always the rebellious kid. I was always the kid that didn't necessarily follow a lot of the rules. I was always the kid that did what I wanted, how I wanted. And so I was often penalized. I was often grounded. I was often, made to feel bad about how I was behaving and acting. And so I think LSD helped me to come to realize and come to terms with who I really was and recognize that, it could just very well have been that I was born in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or in other words, the issue wasn't with me. The issue was more the sort of sheltered culture and environment that I was raised in.
It starts with just taking that leap.
Man, you have to work hard. You have to be incredibly smart.
Choose something that even if it fails, you are going to be proud of it.
Doesn't matter how badly you got beaten in that.
Be kind, be kind, be kind.
Become a better person, a better leader, the better business.
Go with your gut.
I'm Samuel Donner, and this is Finding Founders.
Say your full name and 3 to 4 sentences about who you are and what you do.
My name is Paul Austin. I'm the founder of Third Wave, and my mission is to normalize psychedelics through the lens of microdosing so more people have access to these medicines in a way that's helpful and beneficial.
Yeah, and I feel like you started this engagement with substances pretty early on. Can you tell me about when you got caught smoking weed, and maybe a little bit how you got introduced to the substance, and then what your familial reaction was?
So at the age of 16, I had just turned 16, so I had just gotten my driver's license. It's mid-August 2006, and my best friend in high school invites me out to this hippie hut. And apparently a friend of his had made a makeshift pipe and was going to smoke cannabis for the first time. And so naturally, I went out, I smoked weed, I had a lot of fun, I laughed a lot, connected with these friends a lot, thought it was super interesting. And then a couple more times after that, that same friend and I ended up smoking cannabis out of makeshift, basically, pipes and bongs. And after the third time, we were planning to do it a fourth time, and we were texting back and forth on AOL Instant Messenger. So that dates me a little bit. And I accidentally left up our conversation on the family desktop because we had one computer that we all shared at home. And my mom found it. I was out on a Friday night with friends. She found it. She called me home. She had printed it off. She circled how you're
she
smoking
printed
weed.
It off. She had the evidence. She was prepared.
Oh, yeah, she had the evidence. I can't believe you would do this. We're going to have a conversation about this. So 2 days later, Sunday after church, my parents sit me down. They're very serious. They cannot believe that I would ever have smoked weed. And my dad looks at me and says, I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident, 35 years prior to that. So clearly, they were heavily impacted by the fact that I would use an illegal drug like cannabis. I was raised in a very sheltered environment. I mean, I couldn't watch rated R movies till I was 17. I couldn't play, rated R video games. I couldn't drink any alcohol whatsoever around my parents. So it was very, very sheltered. So to have this sheltered golden boy, smoke an illegal drug just really blew my parents' world apart.
When you were confronted by that little intervention, what was going through your head? Was it oh, I need to stop this, this is serious? Or was it I don't think these people know what they're doing, or maybe a little mix or something completely different? What was the internal monologue at 16?
The internal monologue was, my parents are definitely overreacting, right? I don't feel it's appropriate to crack down this hard, because then they ended up grounding me for 2 months. Basically, for the rest of my junior year of high school, I had 11 p.m. curfew. I could not spend the night at any friends' houses whatsoever. So on one hand, I was like, this is way of an overreaction. And on the other hand, I didn't necessarily stop. I mean, I was I was never that into it anyway, at least at the age of 16 and 17. So sure, I stopped for a couple months because I was grounded. I literally couldn't leave my house. I mean, outside of going to school. But then after that, I would still find my way to cannabis maybe once or twice a month. I would smoke cigarettes here and there. I was an athlete. I played soccer, so I wasn't necessarily super into smoking, but I would do it here and there. And then, soon after that, I also found my way to alcohol. And so I would drink here and there. It was never crazy. It was never obscene. It was never a bunch, at least until I was in college. But I definitely felt like they don't really know what they're talking about. And I'm not going to necessarily stop this because of their opinion.
And so it seems like you just continued down the path of exploration, which would eventually land you in the world of psychedelics. So did that same friend introduce you to that as well? And also, were your parents like very like wary of this friend that you had?
Surprisingly, no. Like they kind of loved him like a son in a way as well. Like my parents are very loving people, and I had a lot of unconditional love. I think that initial reaction to cannabis, and later on when I told them about my LSD experiences as well, it was a reaction that came from a lot of conditioning. But this friend of mine, we had been close friends for a long time. We met because we both played violin in the symphony orchestra, and so he was overall like a good kid, but not necessarily as sheltered as
not necessarily straight edge.
Exactly. And so we went to separate universities, right? So we graduated high school, went to separate universities. He's back home for winter break in West Michigan. He had been going to school in Chicago, and he's like, Paul, I found mushrooms. I think we should do them. So the same friend then introduces me to psilocybin mushrooms, and the first way that I did it is I snuck into the basement of my fraternity house over winter break. They'd usually lock this off over winter break, change the keypad. Because my dad worked at the university that I was attending, he was able to get me in because I told him I forgot something. We were able to sneak in and do mushrooms in the basement of that fraternity house. Watched Pink Floyd's The Wall. I did about 2 grams of psilocybin mushrooms. It was interesting, but not super profound. And about 5 months after that, a different friend introduced me to LSD. And I had a macrodose experience with LSD on like an early May day. It was the final Friday before they were letting
when you say
university
macrodose,
out.
Like what are we talking in terms of like UGs?
It was probably around 200 micrograms of LSD. So,
a regular
high
hit's
enough.
like around like 100
it's about 2
micrograms, right?
hits.
So it's like twice normal, which like I feel for LSD, it kind of like exponentially compounds.
It can exponentially compound, but it was never insanely intense. It was never too much. It was never overwhelming. I was outdoors the entire time. Yeah, we were mostly outdoors, so it was never too overwhelming or too much. And the sort of main takeaway, main experience of it is, wow, I feel really deeply connected to everything around me, in particular the trees, the woods, the forest, the nature. And I also, the friend who introduced me to LSD told me, there's going to be this sort of thing of before LSD and after LSD. And I distinctly felt that. Like my worldview and perspective coming up to that point in time was not shattered, but it definitely evolved and shifted from that initial experience with LSD, and continued to evolve because for the next 2 or 3 years, I did LSD about 15 times in total.
What was the main shift that started when you first did LSD?
A big one was that I had taken on a lot of shame and guilt from being raised in a sheltered and religious environment. So I was always the rebellious kid. I was always the kid that didn't necessarily follow a lot of the rules. I was always the kid that did what I wanted, how I wanted. And so I was often penalized. I was often grounded. I was often, made to feel bad about how I was behaving and acting. And so I think LSD helped me to come to realize and come to terms with like who I really was, and recognize that, it could just very well have been that I was born in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or in other words, the issue wasn't with me. The issue was more the sort of sheltered culture and environment that I was raised in. And so it allowed me to sort of love myself in a deeper way and also feel the unconditional love of a higher power, because I had been raised in the Christian church. I'd gone to church every single Sunday for basically 18 years for 3 or 4 hours every Sunday, but I never got it. Right. And so at the age of 17, 18, 19, I was starting to get more into atheism and reading about atheism. And it wasn't until I did LSD that I started to really understand some of the lessons and teachings from mainstream religions.
It's interesting. I feel like I followed a very similar route of trending towards atheism, thinking I had all the tools to navigate the world. And then you have an experience that kind of like breaks your idea that you have all the tools and to understand the world, and then I think you turn back to the teachings of religion, and also like just like this awe and wonder about the world, which can make things more exciting, and also I imagine make the experience one that you want to return to. So like when you have had this experience of maybe contextualizing some of the religious doctrine that you just been taught, or maybe had not really integrated as a kid, like how did that intertwining of your spiritual education and like further trips I guess like produce a more a more concrete worldview about how like LSD and psychedelic trips intertwines with your like spiritual worldview? And I guess like a simpler way of putting it is, as you had more psychedelic experiences, what kind of crystallized as your spiritual worldview?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I started to read pretty deeply into Aldous Huxley. He wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy, where he talks about how all the mystical traditions of Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, there is a clear and distinct relationship between the mystical traditions of all of the major world religions. And so I started to try to get more of a language and an understanding for what was I experiencing with these high doses of psychedelics, what was the meaning behind it. And Huxley also wrote a fantastic book called The Doors of Perception about heaven and hell. And so I think a big takeaway that I got from these early experiences with psychedelics, with the overlap of spirituality, is in the Christian church, we're always taught that heaven and hell are places we go after death. But one of the key insights that I had from the psychedelic experience is that death is an illusion, that we don't actually die, that the individual egoic self may die, but that life force continues on, right? And this is why the Buddhist talks about reincarnation and karma. So there's more than of an identification with some of these Eastern philosophies, because Eastern philosophy is actually more attuned to the mystical experience because of how it's developed in particular. Christianity and Islam are not quite as attuned to the mystical experience. And so to kind of like bring this full circle, I came to realize that by actively practicing personal development, that I could actually experience heaven on earth, right? And so that then required living in integrity, being honest and transparent, meditating, spending time in contemplative practices, eating really healthy food, exercising, taking care of my physical body, right? So there started to become sort of a holistic lens on what does it take to actually live in an enlightened way, live in a way that is vital, live in a way that is present, live in a way that is also devoted and committed to creativity and transformation and entrepreneurship, that otherwise really wasn't in my awareness prior to psychedelics.
So like what were the, this is maybe trending a little bit away from your main story, but I'm curious about this. Like what were the books that you read that you think really helped solidify that worldview, and what are the habits, or I don't know if you did any retreats or something that further that worldview too? Because I have The Doors of Perception on my desk right now.
Nice, perfect. That's great.
And then I also have been looking at this on the psychedelic experience, which I feel like it's like on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which I like. When reading that, it feels like I was raised Catholic, but it feels like the Catholic tradition. There's like things about it that tie directly to like the Tibetan tradition, like, oh, like that's what they're referencing, and when they're talking about like heaven or hell or whatever it may be. But yeah, I'm curious what like books that you read solidified that, and then what kind of habits solidified it too.
Interestingly enough, when I first started to do psychedelics, there was a website that was very popular called Stumble Upon. And so essentially Stumble Upon was like, you would put a category in, and then it would take you to kind of random web pages that would be about that category, right? So a category that I would often explore was personal development. And then it would take you would stumble upon different high-ranking web pages that were about personal development. And so I'd spend hours and hours on Stumble Upon, just stumbling upon books and personal development, sort of top 10 books to read or top 50 books to read. So the first one was The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck, which was sort of framed as the granddaddy of personal development books, right? And it kind of talked about how if you really want to live a life that's worth living, you have to go on the road less traveled. You have to pursue an unconventional path, right? And I think I kind of go back to the Robert Frost quote about this, right? That there's two paths, and I chose the one that that hadn't been trodden upon, or whatever language is used there. So that was like the very first personal development book that I read. Now, after I got into psychedelics, I started to recognize the value of meditation. And there was a really good book called Wherever You Go, There You Are by John Kabat-Zinn. And John is still alive. He's I think a professor at Harvard, and he does research on mindfulness-based stress reduction. And so he's done a lot of research on how we can have mindfulness-based meditation that gets woven in. And so I started to meditate for 20 to 30 minutes every day as a result of reading that book. And then the third thing that I really got pretty deep into, not a book necessarily, but a great blog, was Mark's Daily Apple, which was an early blog in the sort of paleo-primal sphere that was written by Mark Sisson, who ended up starting Primal Blueprint. And so it was all about how the more that we can live in relationship to our evolution, so the more that we can eat like our ancestors always ate, the more that we can move like our ancestors always moved, the more that we can relate like our ancestors always related, the healthier we will become, right? And there were dozens of other books as well. I got really deep into literature. I read War and Peace. I read the Brothers Karamazov. I read Lord of the Flies. I read a lot of 1984 by George Orwell, as well as some of his other material. So I was a really big reader when I was 10, 11, 12. And then it wasn't so cool when I was in high school. And when I did acid, that's when it kicked off my sort of reading habit again. And I've been a voracious reader ever since. But The Road Less Traveled, Wherever You Go, There You Are, and then Mark Sisson's Mark's Daily Apple blog were, I would say, super influential in those early years. And then the habits were reflected by that. The habits were meditate, paleo diet, CrossFit. I was also a college athlete, so it was important that I ate clean and that I exercised a lot, minimized alcohol as much as possible, and then just did my best to be more outgoing.
So going into your travels, so like I want to talk a little bit about like getting on an online job. I want to talk a little bit about like going to like why you started traveling so intensely, because like you went to over like 75 countries. You were also experimenting with psychedelics through that period. So what kickstarted that that section of your life, because that feels like the unconventional life that you were reading about?
So growing up, my parents would always take us on trips. I had two sisters and myself. So I went to Alaska when I was 7. We would go to Texas to visit Houston every year. I grew up in Michigan. I went to DC. We went out to the Cascades in Washington. I went to Costa Rica when I was 12. I went to Romania when I was 17 with a church mission trip. Various other places, mostly in the States. So my parents, we were very middle class, lived very frugally, but they always spent money on one big trip for our family every year. So I grew up traveling. I grew up with a love and a curiosity for it. And then in college, I went to Ireland when I was 18. I went to Tanzania when I was 19, where I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And then I traveled, backpacked through Europe for 6 weeks. And so when I was 20, just before my senior year of college. And so I already had some travel experience. And so it wasn't too big of a leap to go, okay, what do I want to do out of school? Well, I can either go get an MBA or go to graduate school or get a conventional job, and I can make money, and I can make a lot of money. Or, like they say in Fight Club, because that was another book that was pretty influential in those days, was we make all this money so we can buy shit that we don't need. Because the other thing that I got really into was minimalism. Right. And so I'm like, I don't need a bunch of stuff. I can be happy without a bunch of stuff. So I pared everything down, and I thought, how cool would it be to be as free as possible? Because the core thing when you have a mystical experience, especially with psychedelics, is there's this deep desire for sovereignty that comes from that, and freedom and choice and autonomy. Right. And so I thought, if I can live wherever I want, do whatever I want, and be whoever I want, then that to me is sort of the life jackpot. And so I just happened to find, I was very practical, and then I knew teaching English was the quickest way to be able to travel immediately. And so my senior year of college, over winter break, I got a certificate to teach English. I used that to get a job teaching English in Turkey in a place called Izmir. And then while I was teaching English at that private school in Turkey, I would work about 15, 20 hours a week, and all the rest of the time I would spend studying. I launched my first online business.
Yeah, can you tell me about why you launched that business and what was the idea behind it? Where were you getting your information to launch it? How were you thinking about launching it? All the things that come with turning an idea into something that is actually in reality.
I mean, I read voraciously. So I read, The E-Startup by Eric Ries. I read, Robert Cialdini, all about the psychology of persuasion, a book called Influence. So I took this program called Copy Hour, which was all about hand copying sales pages to learn how to write sales copy. And then I launched my first company when I moved to Thailand in 2014, which was I took the teaching English skill and built an online course and educational platform around that, and just started recording videos for it. And the reason for that was because I wanted to be able to travel. And so I thought if I worked remotely, I started an online business, inspired by Tim Ferriss and the 4-Hour Workweek, that I could live wherever I wanted. And I specifically chose Chiang Mai in Thailand because this is 2014. You could live a really nice lifestyle for about $1,000 a month. That would include your apartment, your scooter, all the food, and in addition to that, I could travel basically for free, because while I was in Turkey, I also hacked the shit out of credit cards. So I studied how I could sign up for credit cards, how I could meet minimum spending requirements, and then how I could acquire hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of just free miles. And so at the age of 23 and 24, I was booking business class flights all around the world with all of these credit cards that I was basically travel hacking with. And so I figured out a way to live very cheaply, not pay any money really to book flights, and then just choose where I wanted to go, when I wanted to go. And that's how I lived from basically the age of 22 until the age of 27. And I'll pause there because there's more in that.
Yeah. So, I love the travel hacking thing. That's awesome. But a little bit more about what was the buildup of the online business, right? Because you record videos from it. You have this idea that you've taken from learning how to teach English from another company. You're okay, now I want to scale myself. I want to be able to live anywhere I want. So you're putting these videos on the internet, but what were the first couple sales? What did momentum start to look like with the business? How did you balance traveling all of these places with the business? Making sure the business is growing. What did that come up look like?
Yeah, so I started teaching English online through like third-party providers, like italki.com was one, and I also got employed by a French company where I would teach English to corporate French people. And I hit this ceiling where I was making 50, 60 bucks an hour, working 10, 15 hours a week. But I was like, if I want to make more than that, I have to start my own website. And so I figured out how to, I got a domain. I figured out what I wanted to focus on. I figured out how I was going to start to do some early digital marketing by publishing content for SEO and publishing YouTube videos. And then I just started to offer private one-to-one coaching for the TOEFL test. And the TOEFL test is a standardized English test that non-native speakers must take in order to get an MBA, or immigrants will take it in the United States in order to get a job promotion. And so I just picked a problem that was people would pay a lot of money to fix, because if they fixed it, they could get a massive promotion, they could get their MBA, it would be the next stage in their professional career. And I specifically focused on speaking. So I coach people on how they could become more confident, how they could speak more clearly, how they could be more articulate, better punctuation, better grammar, all these sorts of things. And it basically grew into a 3-part thing where I had an online course that you could buy. I did group coaching for people who were interested in group coaching, and then I did one-on-one coaching. It was a higher ticket price. And over 3 years, from 2014 to 2017, I probably scaled that. I probably was making up to $250,000 a year.
Wow.
All in. And then in 2017, I sold it to sort of someone I had mentored in the space, because by that point in time, I had started Third Wave, the psychedelic stuff, which was really starting to take off.
So with that business, can you walk me through what it's like to sell something like that? Because I'm curious if there was any fear of letting go of something that was working, like fear of trying to find something else that was working, just any attachment that you had to it in general. I mean, it's your first business. Was it a hard decision to let that go? How do you know it's the right time? How do you know you're getting the right amount of money out of it? Is that even a concern? All of these questions that come up when you're selling a business, because this is the first time that you've sold something like that, and it's your baby, right? It's the first business that has given you the freedom that you've had up until this point. And so yeah, I'm curious what the questions are around selling a business like that.
Yeah, and my story was a little unique because by 2017, I think I sold it in October 2017, Third Wave had really started to take off. And I had been, for microdosing and psychedelic specific stuff, I had been in the New York Times, I had had a feature in Rolling Stone, I had been in Forbes. So it essentially was this is starting to gain so much traction that to run this other business just feels like it wouldn't be the best use of my time. It felt much more like a stepping stone, and that's always how I perceived it. I was like, I don't want to be an English teacher for the rest of my life. I'm going to go hard at this. I'm going to do my best at it. I'm going to use it as a laboratory, as an experiment to figure out how to be good at online marketing and digital entrepreneurship. But I always perceived it as a stepping stone. So there really was very little attachment to it. I was happy to have done it. And honestly, I didn't sell it for much. It was basically I was either just gonna I was either just gonna just let it die so I could focus on this Third Wave full time, or just sell it for not much at all to a friend of mine who I had helped to mentor, who I think could continue the legacy of it and keep it going. And still 7 years later, he's been running it and growing it and building it. And so we did a deal where it was take this over for free. You don't have to pay me anything up front, but I want a royalty on the money on an ongoing basis in terms of what continues to come in from it as an asset. And that then allowed me to create the space to not only continue to build Third Wave, but at that point in time, I was also getting ready to launch a legal psilocybin center in the Netherlands called Synthesis, which ended up being a pretty massive project as well.
So now let's get back into the psychedelic world. So can you tell me about the Tim Ferriss podcast that kind of kickstarted the renewed interest in that world?
So when I had done a lot of this LSD and psilocybin mushrooms at the age of 19, 20, 21, they were beneficial experiences. I felt amazing for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks after, but I still assumed that because these were illegal, that they were still harming me in some ways. And so I was willing to be rebellious in that way because the experiences themselves were so incredible. But there was a lot of cognitive dissonance because I was like, but these are illegal, so shouldn't they be bad? And it wasn't until I listened to that podcast by Tim Ferriss. So he interviewed a guy named Dr. James Fadiman. Dr. Fadiman is an OG from the 60s who really helped to start kind of the movement around microdosing when he published a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide in 2011. And so Tim had Jim on to talk about the topic of microdosing. And I'm in Chiang Mai at the time. I'm building my first business. And I'm like, I'm interested in what could help me to be a little bit more productive and spend more time in flow. And I listened to this podcast and I was like, I think microdosing could help with this, because the way that Jim was talking about it was like people notice that there's less resistance, there's less creative resistance, they're in flow more often. And I thought back to those early high dose experiences with psychedelics, and I was like, maybe this is a way to elongate some of that afterglow that I experienced with high doses of psychedelics. And so in May 2015, I managed to acquire some LSD. And then in July 2015, I started to microdose for the first time and found that it was really helpful and really useful. And my two core intentions in that initial microdosing protocol was to drink less alcohol. So to basically lean on LSD as a social inebriant rather than alcohol, to be more extroverted. And then the other one was to spend more time in flow as I was building these creative projects. And that was highly influential, because then as I, started to go down the rabbit hole of microdosing and psychedelics, I started to realize, there's a rich history here. These have been used for thousands of years. There's actually clinical research that shows how effective they are for depression and addiction and PTSD. And there's a lot of benefits to them that I was not aware of previous to that point in time.
Is there a reason that you microdosed with LSD versus like a psilocybin or like mushrooms?
So I had always preferred LSD. Even now today, I still prefer LSD. And the fundamental difference between LSD and psilocybin comes down to dopamine. LSD is more dopaminergic, meaning more dopamine is produced with LSD, which is tied to focus, attention, and motivation. So I have more of a slightly melancholic personality, and LSD always just made me kind of like how I felt I should always feel. Maybe more extroverted, maybe more focused, gave me a better mood, more energy, all these sorts of things. And so it just sort of felt like a natural medicine for me, whereas I always felt with psilocybin, it's a little too heavy on the body. I've still microdosed quite a bit with psilocybin, but it's a bit more somatic, and I like the energy. I like the activity behind LSD, so that's why I chose it at that point in time. Because even at that point in 2015, there was no difference between psilocybin and LSD in terms of accessibility. Nowadays, mushrooms are way easier to get.
Yeah,
that's what a lot of people go to. But LSD at that point in time, it was like I still had to go on the dark web regardless.
Yeah. Something I've noticed with microdosing, I didn't notice this with microdosing LSD, but microdosing mushrooms, I've noticed a mood, like the next day, like a noticeable mood, like depressant, following the next day. And I'm curious, have you, in your microdosing experience, have you experienced a lower than baseline afterward? After the day on, you did every 4 days, so like a first day was like obviously more dopamine, but do you notice a lower baseline on any of the following days or no?
So when I started to microdose in 2015, I was doing it twice a week for 7 months. Technically, I would say it was a bit more than a microdose. I was probably doing something between 20 and 25 mics, but even at that time, I was just cutting off really tiny pieces of tabs and taking them, so it wasn't a super precise science at that point in time.
I did volumetric measuring, where I put it in like a bottle and filled
you dilute it and it's volumetrically dosed and you can be more precise. I had access to none of those things at that point in time, so I was just like, I'm gonna eyeball it. And I felt it. It was still sub-intoxicating. I could go to CrossFit. I could work on what I needed to work on, so it wasn't too much. And so the day of it was great. The next day I still felt sort of the afterglow. And then the third day I sort of come down a little bit. But I wouldn't say I've ever noticed it's dropped me below baseline. I would say when I've been or gone through bouts of depression, which now that I've I've quit smoking cannabis, it's very rare. Microdosing will help me kind of get up and out of that. But at this point in time, I'm mostly microdosing with San Pedro. And I just do it to help keep a stable baseline. And
what's San Pedro?
Huachuma. It's a cacti from the Sacred Valley in Peru. It has mescaline, which is the active alkaloid in it, the same thing that's in peyote.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Why did you switch to that?
Because my hypothesis is that the mechanism of action as to why microdosing is so effective at so many things is because it's anti-inflammatory, and that chronic inflammation is tied to a lot of mood issues and energy issues. And San Pedro, Huachuma, is the most anti-inflammatory of all of the psychedelics. So more so than LSD and more so than psilocybin mushrooms. And so I've been microdosing 3 times a week for the last 2 months with that. And I've noticed like my energy is amazing. My mood is stable. My focus is on point. It's just been really, really helpful overall.
And more than like, are you like doing like drinking coffee at all, or is it just that?
I drink pu'er tea usually in the morning first thing, and then I'll have a little bit of coffee as well. I can tolerate stimulation reasonably well, but I only have 1 cup of coffee and a little bit of tea. And the San Pedro is less stimulating than LSD. If I'm microdosing with LSD, I don't necessarily drink coffee. I only have tea, because LSD tends to be a little too much if it's combined with coffee.
What's the dosage on your San Pedro microdose?
Good question. So like I mentioned before, the typical microdose for LSD, I actually didn't mention this, the typical microdose for LSD is 10 micrograms. With mushrooms, it's about 100 milligrams. With San Pedro, it's about 1 gram.
1 gram. Well, noted. Okay, so you hear this, like the wonders of microdosing with James Fadiman on the Tim Ferriss show. How does that inspire you to actually start something within that niche? And like, what is the thing that you start?
So 2 friends came out to visit me in Budapest. I was living there in the summer of 2015 between stints in Chiang Mai, because Budapest in the old USSR bloc was very inexpensive as well, and it's a beautiful city. So I moved there July 2015. These 2 friends come to visit, and we're like, I got a bunch of acid, let's do a bunch of acid. So we went out to this beautiful park called Normafa in the outskirts of Budapest. We took about 2.5 to 3 hits of LSD, each one of us, and then had this amazing, epic experience in these sort of wooded meadows overlooking the Danube in Budapest. And we're sitting there and we're just talking about the future of psychedelics and how Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss are starting to publish podcasts, and more clinical research is coming out, and cannabis is being reevaluated. And we just thought, if we build something now, we could be at the forefront of this as it really starts to generate more momentum. And these 2 friends, they didn't necessarily help me build it. They were just in the ideation phase. And we framed it as this 3rd wave of psychedelics. That in the first wave of psychedelics, we had this ancient and indigenous use of plant medicines. The second wave was the counterculture. And the third wave is now combining ancient and modern technology to welcome and usher psychedelics into the sort of modern time. And the intention behind the third wave of psychedelics was to not repeat the mistakes of the 60s. But the focus wasn't on turning on, tuning in and dropping out, but that the focus was turning on, tuning in and dropping in. That the focus was on how are we actually building and creating something new with the energy that's coming through the psychedelic experience, utilizing microdosing as a bridge to make this more culturally accessible and available. So from the get-go, when I started Third Wave in 2015, I had done a lot of high doses myself, but my mission was to legalize psychedelics, and it continues to be that, right? My mission has been to culturally normalize psychedelics, and it continues to be that. And my belief was that LSD was not the problem in the 60s. It was that we were doing way too much of it. And so if we could let people know that you actually only need to do a tiny bit of it every now and then, once or twice a week, to experience its benefits, then it would make it a lot more accessible to a lot more people. And so Third Wave started as an educational platform. It's continued to grow as an educational and media platform. And that has been sort of my golden goose in this space, because I've launched a number of other companies and nonprofits off the back of that as well.
What has been some of the response from that like educational resource?
I paid a lot of attention to brand. I paid a lot of attention to how it was framed, the education and information. So the intention from the get-go was to make it accessible but trustworthy, right? And so we have a lot of long-form guides that are backed by footnotes and clinical research, but they're not so extensive or so academically focused that a layperson can't understand them. We also have podcasts where I've interviewed, clinical researchers and academics and medical doctors and writers and coaches and other folks. And again, interpreting their context and their information for a mainstream audience. So a lot of people say Third Wave has been an essential sort of Sherpa on the path of transformation, that it's really helped me to better understand the pros and cons, the benefits and risks of working with these substances. We also now have a directory of practitioners, because as this space has grown, the biggest risk that I perceive to be the case now are unethical practitioners, or practitioners who aren't good at what they do. And so we've developed a vetted list of retreat centers, clinics, therapists, and coaches that individuals can work with if they're interested in working with psychedelics. So it continues to be a great resource. And I'd say the crux of it is it's a bridge. It's a bridge for people who have never done psychedelics, who are curious about them, but want to make sure they're doing them in a safe and effective way.
What are some of like the stories that have come out of it, of like maybe individuals that, because I would love to ground what you're doing in maybe some individual experiences. Like, what have you heard from people that have encountered your guides or your directories of like, oh wow, this has like changed my life in some way?
When it comes to microdosing, I do a group coaching experience with microdosing, where I'll guide a group of 50 people or so through an 8-week experience. And a lot of people come out of that, they've been able to wean off psychiatric medications, most commonly SSRIs. They've been able to finally make decisions that they had been procrastinating on for a long time. It could be that they finally have the energy and the mood to really get ahead of the curve and take control of their lives. We've had people who have gone through that where it's been really beneficial for them in terms of relationships with business partners or with loved ones. So microdosing tends to be where a lot of the beginners come in, but also, the most, I would even speak to the most recent project, which is the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. We're training practitioners now. And so initially when I started Third Wave in 2015, the emphasis was on the broader populace, but I've been focusing more and more on coaches, practitioners, doctors. And what I hear again and again is people who go through our training program is there's so much emphasis on walking the walk. And that's often what I come back to with psychedelic experiences, especially for those who are supporting others, that we first have to walk the path ourselves. We have to navigate the territory. We have to understand what challenges may arise on our own journey before we can help others to navigate through it. And so I think in walking the walk, right, people are able to go through their own transformative experience with psychedelics, and they come out the other side with more depth and capacity to hold others as they're navigating it. Because psychedelics, a huge part of their benefit is that they are destabilizing, right? They destabilize patterns and behaviors and ruts that allow for new choices and new decisions to be made. But if that destabilization isn't pointed towards a specific goal, objective, or outcome, or if it's not held in community, then it can actually create chaos and challenge rather than true transformation. And so what we hear again and again is the way that we hold people, the community that has been cultivated and developed, and the responsibility and sort of reverence that people hold this medicine work with it's recognized and noticed and observed. And that for me has always been the North Star, coming back to even the early part of my story, freedom and sovereignty. But I think integrity is also important, and transparency. That psychedelics, when we work with them, if we aren't really being humble and honest and transparent and in integrity, that they can wreck our lives at times, that they're not always the kindest. And so they do a thing where they sort of help to remind us of not to get too ahead of ourselves, right? Not to believe our own bullshit too much.
You've talked a lot about like the entryway to psychedelics being like microdosing, but I'm curious, for you, how has your how have you deepened in your psychedelic use outside of microdosing? Because it seems like you've gotten your microdosing regimen pretty down and dialed in, but then in terms of macrodosing for more mystical experiences, or are those things that you're even still pursuing or looking at or exploring? What does the deep end look like for you?
So a lot of my deeper medicine shadow work is around ayahuasca at this point in time. And so it's been over a year now since I've been in ceremony and worked with ayahuasca. But typically, if I'm working with high doses in an intentional way, I'm working with ayahuasca with incredible facilitators and shamans. Sometimes the Shipibo people, who are an indigenous people in Peru who work with ayahuasca, but not always. I also do a lot of work with, not a lot, but some work with ketamine and body work. So ketamine is a dissociative and anesthetic, and when it's used, specifically when it's used rectally, which is how I've used it in the past, it can be an incredible ally when it's combined with body work, which is more intense than massage. It's like when someone gets into your fascia and tissue and opens it up. And then the other high dose that I still do once or twice a year is LSD. So I still love working with high doses of LSD.
And is that a solo trip that you're doing?
Sometimes, but I prefer with friends.
Yeah.
I prefer with a friend or two, typically outside, typically in nature, hiking, moving. Those are the three most common ways that I'll still work with higher doses of psychedelics. And again, it's usually every 3 to 6 months, so it's not super often, but it's often enough where it's really a practice that I've developed and cultivated.
What do you think those walking high dose LSD journeys provide for you?
It's almost like a vision quest in a way, right? Where I go out with minimal water, I go as far out as I can, and I really sort of test my limits, because when you take LSD, especially at high doses, you have so much energy moving through. And so it sort of brings me back to this primal, wild origin of who I am deeply at my core. So it helps me to sort of let go of the fetters of modernity and all of the armoring that I've taken on, and just be sort of like a wild animal in the wilderness for 8 to 10 hours.
Interesting. So going back to what you've been working on, and what has it been one of your more recent things published, mastering microdosing. Can you tell me a little bit why you made that, and what are you hoping it does?
So when I first started to microdose, it was in Budapest and then in Chiang Mai. And this is right after I started Third Wave. And I self-published a book on microdosing in 2016 that I just put up on Amazon, just as a way to get something
early.
Put out. Wow. Super early. Awesome. It was the first book by far. It was called Microdosing Psychedelics, A Practical Guide to Upgrade Your Life. And then in 2018, I republished it. I did a little bit more work, hired a proper ghostwriter, fleshed it out a little bit more, but it still wasn't what I knew it could be. And so 2021, I hired a proper team and really finished it and brought in a lot of the new research at that point in time. And so mastering microdosing is like my frame on microdosing, why it's important, what the clinical research says, and how people can utilize it for benefit. So it's part story, part anecdote, part reference. And even behind the name of the book, Mastering Microdosing, what I'm insinuating is that working with psychedelics is a skill. So just like we can learn to read, just like we can learn to write, just like we can learn to cook or play a sport or play an instrument, we can learn to work with psychedelics in a more skillful way. And that the more skilled we become at working with psychedelics, the more powerful of a creator we become. And the best metaphor for this is Fantasia, right? When Mickey gets hold of the broom and he makes things go wild and crazy. So if we don't know how to work with psychedelics appropriately, chaos ensues. But if we know how to work with them in an intentional, responsible, and effective way, then we become basically wizards of our own lives. And the capacity to manifest and create what it is that we want to manifest and create becomes much easier because we're willing to do the work, but also adapt and change in such a way that allows that path and that process to emerge.
So what are you working on now? What are you most excited about for the future?
I love to teach and educate. So we're now in our 7th cohort of our practitioner training program. We'll start our 8th cohort pretty soon. We do an intensive, a retreat as part of that in Costa Rica. So I love being on retreats. I love being with students. I love to teach and just watch how these students grow and develop so they can go out and support others in the world. So that's what a lot of my time and energy is being spent on right now. That's through the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. And then I'm working on a couple new projects that will be specifically for founders, entrepreneurs, creatives, executives who are on a path of personal transformation with psychedelics. And so I love these models that EO and YPO have created, where they're membership organizations for founders and entrepreneurs and executives to have community, collaboration, accountability in a professional sphere. And I think a lot of founders are becoming more curious about psychedelics and they're looking for professional support in that way. And so I'm starting a project that will essentially be a membership group for entrepreneurs who are interested in, mentorship and guidance as they deepen their path with psychedelics. And so that will be coming out towards the end of this year. And that, I think, speaks to my overall sort of ethos, is this third wave of psychedelics is an archipelago. It's a psychedelic archipelago. And so I intend to create, not 5, not 10, but dozens of companies and brands and nonprofits to help ensure that psychedelics can be responsibly legalized and stewarded. And so I really feel like, for me, this is still inning 1. I've been doing this work for almost 10 years now professionally, but I would expect to continue to do it for another 60 years. And that's how I approach this mission and this project. So more than anything, I feel really grateful that I was able to find sort of my ikigai at such a young age. And I will continue to build and grow and develop in this space because I truly and strongly believe that it is a technology that, if wielded with reverence and responsibility, will help humanity to evolve and address the meta crisis that we currently find ourselves confronted with.
Yeah. And I feel like also, that next step of targeting this kind of knowledge to founders, I'm seeing a lot of other companies springing up, looking at like older traditions and specifically tailoring it to like I don't know, more data-driven people. So like I don't know, have you heard of Journey? There's like, they do jhana retreats in like Mexico and a couple other places, but it's like these data-driven Eastern traditions that it seems like they're, and obviously I think what you're doing is like in a similar vein but very different and unique, and it feels like there's more of an appetite for that, which I also think signals an eventual legislative turn, as you have more and more people in positions of power publicly touting the benefits of psychedelics paired with like responsible use and meditation. So feels like a really exciting time to be at the forefront of all of this. So if you were to just look back at your whole story and give one piece of advice to maybe the younger you starting to travel, maybe starting that first company, what advice do you think you would give that person?
I would say be more efficient with your energy, right? Do fewer things, but do them well. And don't be afraid to take time off so you can rest. And I would say that advice I would also currently give myself. So it's sort of like a recurring thing. But I think, you know, when I was early on, I thought, oh, I need to be in a rush. And now that I've settled more into like, I'm going to be doing this for a very long time, I'm able to be a bit more patient with how things emerge and unfold.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Samuel.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, rate the podcast 5 stars, and share with a friend. If you have any questions or comments, DM us at Finding Founders Podcast on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook. Finding Founders is produced and hosted by me, Samuel Donner.
Our Chief of Staff and Operations is Jessica Lynn.
Our audio editing team lead is Adrian Tapia. Support from
Irene Van Berkel,
Matt Fernandez,
Renee Buchanan,
Sophia Donner,
David Saide,
Ashley Jimenez,
Nicholas Guzman,
Aaron Devereaux,
Sanessa Gisley,
and Lois Choi.
Our outreach and research lead is Kenny Ong, with support from
Sarah Hobson,
Charisse Tan,
Harushi Kanauchi,
Kristen Hagelin,
Aya Cortez,
and Valencia Liu.
Our writing team lead is Elizabeth Bowen with support from
Aiden Ashworth,
Nikki Mukawa,
Sylvie Wang,
and Eric Mena.
Our design team lead is Shruti Ramanand with support from
Tiffany Dang,
Yao Liu,
and Dina Gabriel.
To see more of what we're up to, subscribe to our newsletter at findingfounders.co. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.